and thank you for taking the time to join us for today's webinar, Working with Auditors Best Practices. Today, we're joined by Travis Jack from Met CPA and Jason Worms, who will share insights and guidance on how to effectively collaborate with auditors. We'll be taking live questions throughout the session, so you can submit any questions in the chat for our speakers to address during the presentation. Thank you again for joining us today. I'd now like to introduce Travis and Jason.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Ava, for the intro. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules today. I'm Jason Worms. I'm a team leader here at Nova 401k Associates. I'll get into introducing Travis with his bio here in a little bit, but we're going to be talking today about plan audits and some of the best practices for plan sponsors to know what to expect, and then also to make the audit as smooth of a process as possible. Before we get started, a typical disclaimer for us: this is general information in nature, so while it may apply to your plan, it should not be relied upon as a way to move forward with your particular plan. Please consult a qualified professional, such as an attorney or an accountant, if you need legal or tax advice on your individual circumstances. So what we're going to be talking about today, determining if you need a plan audit, how to select an audit firm that matches your needs, kind of some project management guide for how the process works and how long it takes to go through one of these, ensuring good data, which is kind of the underpinning of the whole audit process, and then resources to help you in your search for an auditing firm, or maybe even to reaffirm that you've chosen the correct one for you already if you have an established audit relationship. So helping me out today is Travis Jack. He's an engagement partner with Met's CPA, and he's got an extensive bio that I'm not going to go into all of the details, but he has been at the forefront of the industry. He's been on many committees, he's been on many task forces, he's been on a lot of leadership roles, kind of shaping how retirement plans get audited, shaping best practices within that industry, doing a lot of liaison work with the EBSA, which is the Employee Benefits Security Administration, and really is a great resource to have on our webinar to talk about audits and how to make them most effective for you. So Travis, thank you for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Nice. Thanks, Jason. Appreciate the intro and the invite. Always a pleasure. Looking forward to digging in a little bit. And I think we'll get to all of those agenda items and have plenty of time for questions. So please definitely throw any questions you may have, anything top of mind, into the chat. And Jason's going to relay them in real time. Because the more dialogue we get, the more I think you kind of extract out of it when it becomes interactive, versus, kind of us cruising through what maybe we think might be good information on the topic. So with that, we'll kind of dive in, but please, of course, as things are coming up, make sure that you ask questions as we go. But yeah, so first thing first is, why do we have to do this in the first place, and what are some of the applicabilities? I think that the demographic mix is a combination of plan sponsors and advisors. Both are incredibly integral to the process, slightly different lens, but the information really overlays to both groups really, really well. But essentially, when you're moving over from a short form to long form filing, there's a couple things to think about both in that first year and general plan design. Is really they change back filing season January 1st, 23 over to participant account balances. And once again, almost throughout, it's always been beginning of the year. And that's still the case. Just one little caveat for startup plans is, in that first year of plan operations, it's going to be the end of your account. They really buried that in the Federal Register and some of the instructions in that first year, generally becoming more common knowledge, but it's kind of the reverse of how it's been done for startup plans, since ERISA's beginning. So one thing to think about, because it's a little bit unusual for those startups. Another aspect as well too is in that short plan year, depending on if it's a new plan, things along those lines, and this is speaking a little bit more to that advisor community as well too, is you can kind of work through if a plan wasn't active and you're just defaulting to a January 1st date, maybe giving that short year plan exemption some thought process as well as you're designing when that start will be for that initial year. Because if it's going to be a little bit larger plan from the get-go, you're able to embed that stub period into the next year's audit. So there's a little checkbox on the 5500 that essentially says, we owe you one for that stub period, and then you can do it all at once. We typically do it all, included in that fixed fee as well too, which kind of helps facilitate a streamlined process initially. And then of course the 8120 rule, which is relatively common knowledge, but if you filed as a short form previously, you can kind of bounce an additional period up to that 100 to 120 range and still elect to file a short form as long as you don't pop over to 121 or above. That's really where being diligent, and nobody does an amazing job on really monitoring a lot of this as well too. But it's something, depending as well too, on the advisor side of things, if you have plans elsewhere as well too, kind of helping keep track of, as plans are getting close to that 120 threshold, are there potentially force outs or terminated participants with balance that can either save them from cresting over that 120 potentially, because you can't really get back down to, you have to be under 100 to get back to that short form filing status. So just something to be cognizant of. We all try and make it an incredibly efficient process, but sometimes as you bump over that threshold, getting back down to 100 is a little bit harder than being under that 120 potentially. So all food for thought. I know, especially before Jason had mentioned as well too, that there's the potential for splitting plans and kind of some other approaches as well too that may be kind of in the works or available depending on plan size and company growth needs as well too. So definitely there could be better on the plan design side. So kind of encapsulating that. And of course, on the PEP and MET side, sometimes if this just really isn't someone's jam, being cognizant that there are tools, Nova has, a variety of PEPs available that may fit that kind of demographic need in the future. But we also have a little bit of a decision tree in terms of applicability. I think on the next slide. There we go. And that kind of walks through the criteria that we just kind of chatted through, but kind of provides a little bit of a visual. And I think all of this information is going to be posted and readily available for you as well too. So something that, once again, Nova is fantastic at. They're actually usually the ones that are first to know in terms of availability aspects that kind of come into play. And we usually liaise pretty closely in terms of if they popped over that threshold and it kind of becomes something that is popping over that audit eligible range, or if there's any questions on kind of some of those areas that are that kind of cut over a little bit. I think that brings us to, there we go. A lot of really good information that came out of the Department of Labor audit quality study. So it was published back in 23, and a lot of the trends from the last audit quality study back in 2011 kind of hold true. There's definitely been an overall uptick in quality. And the next slide we're going to go over a little bit later is kind of how those main criteria broke out. But you would really be surprised in terms of kind of a licensure. Are you licensed in our state? Not all states are mobility states, et cetera. So that's a big thing to think about as well too. We actually, it's rare. More of the due diligence and kind of some of the other aspects really come into play in terms of the RFP process. But even the licensure piece, we actually had a takeover audit of a relatively large PO MEP, and ended up the individual that was doing it was not licensed. So really at the end of the day, by the time we were all finished, realized that this individual used to be a CPA, performing employee benefit plan audits, was getting referred in, and was a unlicensed felon. So that's the last thing that you want to do is, refer someone in who may not have a license. This is a very extreme case, but just kind of goes to show it is a possibility. And then there's a resource page at kind of the end of the slide deck that has kind of the links and ability for you to be able to review, see if a CPA is licensed. There's also a link to pull up their peer review report. Every 3 years, at a minimum, a firm's required to have an external firm come in, review a sample of their work papers and their quality control process. So that's something to be aware of. And the 3 ratings for a peer review are pass with deficiencies, and fail. So very important to be cognizant of you're working with a firm with a good system and process of controls there. Related to the audit quality study, there's a huge amount of correlation between a couple key factors. Ones are, is the firm AICPA Employee Benefit Plan Audit Quality Center members? That had about a 15% or more tilt in terms of deficiency rates. And then also a good thing to ask that isn't publicly available is the number of CPE or continuing professional education credits related to plan audits that both the partner and the team's taken. And all those are in kind of a RFP template document that's also going to be available as well at the end of the presentation and kind of in the resources page. But you're also really the number one correlating factor was number of plan audits that a firm does. So that kind of brings us to the screen on the next page related to some of those criteria in the breakdown. So as you can see, there's been a slight uptick, but as one would anticipate, if someone's dabbling, if someone does 1 to 2 of something, the quality is not going to be great. They just don't necessarily know what to ask, how to ask you, and kind of work through the process, A, efficiently, and B, based on the DO audit quality study, pretty large deficiency ratio. So it's better than the 76% deficiency rate that it was, but it's really only moved the needle to about 70%. So really that's one of the main questions to ask auditors as you're getting into the RFP process or evaluating year over year. The questionnaire that we've included is kind of a quick 4-question format to really give you a pulse check on. You can either put that in your fiduciary file as like a, hey, we've done our due diligence either on the advisor side or the plan sponsor side, depending on how you're structured and kind of team members responsible for all that. But as you get into the 100+ plans, that's kind of the gold standard of where you would want a firm to be at is start 25 to 99s, pretty good. Above 100 is really where it caps out and it's at that highest quality rate. But even then, there's still deficiencies that come up and things that can arrive related to that. So always good. This is probably the number one question to ask, even if you don't have a super formal process and you're not going to go through kind of an annual review of that firm prior to engaging. Getting a pulse on how many audits they do is always a good thing. And it is posted out to EFAS, so it's publicly available, but easy enough to ask as well too. So that's always a big one, and I think that brings us to the next one.
Yeah, and Travis, just jumping in, one of the things that sometimes people don't remember is that just like any service provider for your plan, an audit firm is one that should be reviewed on a periodic basis to make sure that they are the right fit for a plan sponsor, right? So, the audit firm that you've been using forever, that's great, and I'm sure that you love them, but you also want to make sure that you're doing those assessments periodically to make sure that they are adhering with the most recent standards, that they're performing good work for you, and are still a good fit, for you for your plan.
Yes, 100%. And that comes into like a multi-tiered approach as well too, where quality is obviously important. And that one's kind of not always easy to ascertain as well too. So these are some nice tools for that. even just from a cost perspective and ease of use. I think benchmarking some of those things. I think everyone's so good about benchmarking investments, oftentimes, record keeping platforms, but sometimes on the audit side as well too, doesn't always get that kind of forethought as well of like, hey, is this the right fit, both organizationally and just in general from a personnel standpoint. So always something to think about as you're kicking off the year, usually in fall.
Yep. And it's one of those things too, right? Where if you're like in late May, early June, and you're trying to get your audit done before the July 31st deadline, that's probably a little bit too late for you to start doing your benchmarking and and that kind of thing. Like ideally, you want to be starting this earlier in the year.
100%. And I don't think we dug in quite as much on this slide deck in terms of like operational flow. But it really is, I mean, I think it's really nice to start these things in fall leading up to the plan year. Obviously, that's kind of early for some folks, but usually for reoccurring, we always do try and go that approach. And I think like we had touched on, we do have 90% of our sample selections out for all our plan audits. So, and we're tracking to do approximately like about 300 this year. So good amount of volume. And it's one of those things, if you proactively manage it, it gives you a lot of bandwidth to adjust and adapt. Because we do have folks that come in a little later in the year. And that happens. We always want to have some bandwidth to accommodate. But in addition to kind of asking some of those really deep quality questions, either on an annual basis or every 3 years is kind of a nice time frame to do a little bit deeper dive for benchmarking, just to get a feel for, hey, is the market price moved significantly? Are we at a big premium, but we've never benchmarked it and we won't know? But some other things to think about as well too is turnaround time in the RFP process. Because a lot of times if a firm or group within a firm's systems and processes aren't necessarily supporting quick turnaround in your conversations on the front end, it's highly likely that when you onboard, that's not a situation that would improve in terms of time, responsiveness, things along those lines. And there's seasons, of course, but that's something to kind of think about as well too as you're looking at some potential options. The one thing that I really like that gets to the heart of, hey, are you focused on this? Is it like something that you do all year round, or is it a season where you only do it in summer and now everyone that's involved in the process is a little bit behind the 8 ball, so to speak? So that's kind of something to think about as well too. And you can kind of get at that with asking number of audits that they do in the employee benefit plan audit space. And then also what percentage of those audits didn't need an extension. So they were due that 7 months from that filing timeline. What percentage of plans went out the door on time? I think is pretty telling. A good portion skew to closer to the deadline. And I think you can actively manage that back into your good portion being timely filing. So food for thought, that's one I like to ask, and it's pretty simple and kind of gets at the heart of the matter in terms of process planning and concentrations. Also too, of course, to be honest, this is probably on the plan sponsor side, and then also the advisor side as well too. One of the biggest aspects is what's the pricing? Of course, obviously want to be cost effective in maintaining compliance for the plan, and utilize those hard-earned company dollars elsewhere in terms of match, kind of those true hard dollar benefits for team members. So that's of course important. And then also it's always kind of nice to ask of like, okay, that's great for year 1. What's year 2, year 3 in the future look like as well too? So asking for a 3 to 5 year commitment on pricing's kind of a nice best practice as well too on the front end, where you can kind of proactively have those conversations before selecting a vendor. Because unfortunately, I think there's been, we hear quite a few stories out there. We do a minimum 3-year price guarantee, and usually we extend it for another 2 to 3 year cycle. kind of at that same price point. But a lot of times you do hear, folks drastically changing, even sometimes in year 2, for sure in year 3. So nice to ask those questions on the front end. And obviously, I think that like a Nova or advisors that are, for example, would be on this call, like true specialists, are great to weave in. If you're a plan sponsor, you're busy running your business, busy running your department, making sure everyone has what they need. So this isn't always on the forefront. So I think weaving in, group of experts is really nice. It's kind of what they do on a day-to-day basis, all day, every day. So being able to ask someone, be like, hey, how's it going? What are your thoughts? Here's my 3, plan auditors that we're thinking of. Can you kind of help ferret through all the information available in terms of where would be a good one and where might be the best fit potentially. And ultimately, it is structurally your fiduciary responsibility. But I think it really is great to weave in kind of the experts in that space in terms of finalizing decisions and kind of maybe even understanding all the criteria leading up to some of those decisions.
And then I just want to circle back real quick, Travis. When you were talking about the percentage of audits delivered before the filing deadline of July 31st for most plans, the other thing that I hear about from plan sponsors is that getting it done that quickly not only is like a little feather in their cap, but it also keeps it from just lingering, right? Yeah. Because everybody's busy, everybody's wearing multiple hats, and if you get into August and then September and that audit is still hanging over your head, even if there's nothing like an action item for you to do, just knowing that it's out there can add a lot of stress, right? So trying to get that turned around where you can get it filed before July 31st and not need to worry about an extension can be just a big weight off of somebody's shoulders too.
Oh, 100%. And that's why we love working with you guys. It is very nice. It's Parkinson's law, essentially. But work will expand to fit the time allotted to it. So couldn't agree with you more. I think really kind of focusing in on getting it off everyone's plate is fantastic. And I think it really breeds a much more efficient approach. And I think overall, like the process in general is fantastic when that is kind of the goal to kind of take things off plan sponsor plate and then included kind of a finished filing by the original timeline. So couldn't agree more.
Yep. All right. And then I also wanted to get into a little bit more detail talking about the pricing. So I know that Mets has taken the position that the fixed pricing is kind of the way you guys are going. And we have talked offline about how the market is kind of moving towards more of that than an hourly based pricing. But can you kind of talk about that and how that's transitioning and why?
100%. Yeah. So really kind of top of mind. Great question. Because we've been at a fixed price on the audit side for about 15 years. Because I really think that helps drive and align the partnership in terms of, hey, let's make this a better experience, more efficient. How can we move from A to C in the most efficient way possible? And I think, kind of that fixed price guarantee really works quite well in aligning everyone. And I think it's becoming more and more the industry norm. So I think most people are arriving there as well. Been there for a pretty good amount of time just because of that alignment just felt so natural being at that. And sometimes every once in a while, there'll be one or two that does end up being a little bit more out of scope. And I think that's just part of retention and just building that relationship of taking care of what needs to be done at a price point that you said it was going to be at, and kind of building that trust, even when stuff may bubble up of like a 403B, and there's this second or third custodian that as on a takeover plan becomes new news or whatever it is, as we're here for. We've seen pretty much most complex things bubble up from time to time. So that's always another one to ask as well too, as you're interviewing, of like, hey, if things come up, does this change? Is this truly fixed, or is it mostly fixed, but could be an extra invoice after if something different happens. So all really good food for thought when you're interviewing audit firms.
All right. And now let's get into the scary part of the presentation, which talks about what happens if you have a bad audit.
Yeah, 100%. So, and then the funny thing is, I think it is really nuanced, and we had a chance to touch base on this as well too, where EBSA and DOL don't necessarily have direct enforcement authority on plan auditors. So it's a little bit harder for them to call that population of folks that maybe aren't necessarily nailing it. They've been doing a pretty good job working together with AICPA. We're on a lot of task force that they kind of chat through enforcement activities and their planned activities and strategic plans as well too. So pretty abreast of kind of what's happening there as well too. Because the ironic part is, if you're a plan sponsor, you're not going to see that back end work paper that may potentially lead to that substandard audit. That's why all those criteria that are broken out in that RFP document that's available really come into play to ask on the front end, because that substandard audit, you can have a perfectly beautifully compliant plan. There is not a thing out of place. And if the work paper supporting that audit aren't sufficient and it's selected for DOL or EBSA review, that really could move into, typically it's going to be a cure period, which is usually 45 days. And then from there, it moves into, they pull the filing down and you have to have the plan re-audited. And as a plan sponsor, you're responsible for those late penalties, which are incredibly substantial, up to that original filing deadline. So even say you get notice 6 months after the filing was done October 10th, they bring it all the way back to 7/31 to start calculating that penalty. So it's pretty substantial. So usually it's a six-figure amount. Oftentimes they're understanding, and they do work with you on kind of resolving the matter, but it really depends on who you get there and kind of those things as well too. So food for thought, super important process, often overlooked, in terms of kind of asking some of those right questions on the front end.
So Travis, you say that the standard cure period is 45 days. We'll get into timelines in a little bit further in the presentation, but it's pretty rare for an audit to be completed in 45 days. So if a plan needs to be re-audited, does that mean that they're pretty much sunk? Or if they were to engage another CPA, would that CPA be able to go to the Department of Labor and say, we've been engaged to help these folks, can we get an extension on the cure period?
Yes, and the cure, actually, they do give a lot of the firms a chance to remedy the work papers. What we've seen and I guess we always pick up the ones where it didn't make the cure period, because they do give the prior firm a chance to retrospectively correct the work papers. Oftentimes, however, if a firm only does one or two, they just exit the market, which kind of leaves the plan sponsor high and dry to get it re-audited. So it does kind of enter this complex gray period, if you will. And they usually do provide some level of grace related to what they now deem a late filing that went off on time, for example, or with extension. But yeah, it's definitely best to avoid this scenario, for sure.
For sure. Yep.
But and then this is the kind of tail end of what that letter would look like that you would get as a plan sponsor. So that is kind of, that starts the clock, so to speak, on the cure period, and it does give you a little bit of heads up. This letter's a little bit old. The civil penalties actually up. I think it's around 2,700 ballpark. I think it's on the next page. But so that, and Marcus is still there as well too. He's one of the individuals that works really closely with AICPA. So we've had a really nice chance to work. They're really great about if a firm is growing, specializing in this space, and really wants to do a good job. They really do a fantastic job on being a resource. They're not just out in enforcement mode all the time. They're very much in community engagement mode on the auditor side. And we really see this by their commitment to coming to the AICPA conferences, outreach, and really working to make sure the folks that want to do a good job and are willing to put the time and resources into it are, have the resources that they need, and they work pretty closely with us, which is nice.
Nice.
So yes, brings us to the that's not great page. So that is, like we talked about, goes back from wherever that next audit and filing gets filed. It's 2739 back to the original filing date. So that 2.5 months without extension gets wiped off the plate, and then however long it took. Sometimes it's about 6 to 12 months before they actually reach out. And the end of that cycle if it falls out of that cure period. So it can be pretty pricey. Like I said, they're pretty good about waiving certain things. Usually there'll be some level of penalty though related to it, which is unfortunate. I think some of it goes that route as well too, because they have enforcement over the plan sponsors, but usually they have to indirectly work in the auditor community because of how regulations are structured, and CPAs are essentially state board based. So it's a referral to the ethics committee, both at the state level and AICPA, but usually it's a relatively timely, time extensive process. So it takes a little bit before that works its way out of the system. Most auditors doing under 10, once they get a letter like this and it doesn't go well, we'll just exit the market, which I think we might have touched on, but that's part of why the number of auditors went from about 10,000 about 15 years ago is down to about 3,800 ballpark of firms that kind of do this type of work. As a lot of the specialists are kind of continuing to gain trajectory, where a lot of the smaller firms that are kind of dabbling in the space tend to be leaving based on the DOL's enforcement activity and AICPA's kind of more rigid standards that they're applying to the peer review process.
Yep. And then one other thing I wanted to mention here, you talked about how the EBSA regulates the plans, not the auditors. So yes, the penalties that they assess are assessed to the plan sponsor. They aren't passed on to the CPA in the case of a deficient audit. It is the plan sponsor who bears the responsibility of those penalties from the Department of Labor.
Yes, 100%. So that's why it's always super important to ask some of those questions on the front end to get a feel for, hey, statistically, how likely an outcome is this? So always kind of good to have top of mind when you're engaging firms as well.
Yep. All right. So enough of that sadness and big bills to the Department of Labor. Turning on to the good stuff and how we avoid getting those types of results.
100%. But yeah, so in terms of like the project management piece, obviously some of them are slam dunks, and it kind of depends on people's schedule. So, and it's kind of a nice part to include in the discussion piece on the front end as well, is really give yourself plenty of time, especially if it's a first year engagement. We like to start kind of more of that November timeframe. And if you're interviewing firms, I'd even give another month on top of that. So kind of right after 10-15 is a pretty good time to kind of interview firms, touch base, things along those lines to start on the front end. And usually, kind of like a MAP or PAP or more complicated plan type, it almost becomes more essential to get into that front end planning in fall. We usually January 1st start pulling ad hoc reports and samples, et cetera. So that works as well, where we'll try and run in the background like antivirus software of like, oh, wow, you guys are doing all sorts of stuff that even though that was clipping along back there, because usually we'll get online access. We'll work really closely with the NOVA team to make sure everything's set up. And a lot of times that first phase is more on the record keeper side, because they're also busy with compliance. They're working with you to make sure everything's teed up, ready to go. All your testing's good. Any, kind of last minute tweaks are sorted and you're optimized. And then from there, we kind of pick up into the rest of the selections, 1500s and tying everything out. But it is very agile approach of working kind of hand in hand and kind of syncing up the planning with, of course, the service provider side, working with Nova in terms of linking up timelines and making sure everything's set for timely filing. So that's definitely important. So kind of they're really great. Depending on your service providers, you may also need to be a little bit more integrated into the process. So they really take the lead on a lot of this stuff. Depending on your platform type and size, et cetera, you may need to pull a little bit more of this together and kind of actively manage that project. So it really depends. I mean, that's part of the reason why we do a pretty substantial discount. It's like a 2x what our standard would be for Nova plans as well too, which is super helpful just because when you have a concentration you can engage on the planning side, everything becomes a lot more streamlined, better client experience, better experience from an efficiency standpoint for both teams. So it just kind of syncs up and goes very well when you have, kind of that larger footprint with each other. But really kind of working through in terms of the advisor side as well too, of kind of educating plan fiduciaries of kind of their fiduciary, co-fiduciary responsibility for a lot of these things, including some of the penalties that we had chatted about before. And those are relatively, you don't see that all the time. The samples that EPS is able to look at each year isn't over the top, but it is, I think, something to keep in the back of the mind. But also synchronizing data requests and then understanding what data is coming from who. Thankfully, on these type of audits compared to a regular company audit, we're getting the vast majority of everything from Nova and the record keeper directly. So luckily, you're able to kind of keep out of the loop of a lot of it, but there's some process-related stuff and some other items that are a nice touch point. And if you are in, like, say, a bundled solution, there's a little bit more that's going to be on your plate from just a planning perspective and expectation, because usually we're able to break those things out into multiple categories, like if it's a unbundled or Nova plan, where a good portion of that's going to come from them, and they kind of help quarterback the audit process for you. So super helpful, helps keep things streamlined and easy.
Yep, and it's worth mentioning that as plan sponsors and even advisors, you should have a pretty good idea of complexities that you have in your plan, right? If you, most plans have just a single record keeper that holds all of the assets, but occasionally we have plans that have self-directed brokerage accounts or some kind of a pooled asset or a life insurance contract or, God forbid, real estate investments in the plan, things that require, some kind of outside work, getting some information directly from a participant sometimes, or even particularly sticky plan provisions. Like, do you exclude various divisions in your company? Do you have different eligibility provisions for different types of people? Is your compensation definition very complex? Like, all of those are things that, as you have more of those, you want to have more advanced planning with your audit, right? Because that'll make it go smoother if you know those things and are on top of those things, to have those conversations up front.
100%. Nice. So this is kind of a ballpark idea of what if you're starting January 1st, what kind of some of these timelines look like. Also, too, there's a little bit of lead time between the compliance testing, 5500 availability, things like that. So we've had some plans out as early as February for calendar year ends, tail end of February, but usually they kind of fall in that April, May timeframe. The nice thing with a really early start too is by pulling samples and getting you the full universe of, like, hey, here's the things that we need from each respective party. You can then, through the planning call, and then have much more lead time in terms of, like, hey, I can work this into times of the year that are a little bit slower. So outside of, like, open enrollment or peak census gathering time, et cetera. And really, we like to piggyback on the census collection timeframes as well too, so that we're not asking you for the same data that Nova as well too. By kind of working a little bit more closely, we're able to make that experience a little bit more streamlined, less of a time pull down on the plan sponsor side. And really, we both work to design our systems and processes around that client experience as well too. So definitely important. This is kind of a good ballpark idea though of kind of what phases work through and ballpark durations. With that being said, we've had some emergency ones come in last minute, not any NOVA ones. Those are usually very planned, organized, and orchestrated, but some that come in, and we have been able to turn things around from like a October 7th or October 8th turn time. But that's just really all hands on deck. This is a lot more, what you'd be looking for, what we'd all be looking for in terms of early start, synchronized processes. But worst case scenario, we are able to work through stuff that comes in sideways and last minute.
Yeah, and it's worth calling out, right? Like, and this one for your standard audit, on the absolute fastest track there is, you're still looking at a 6-week process. So this is not flicking a switch. This is a pretty involved, is going to take some time to get through all of this work. And for plan sponsors, I often say it's very similar to the annual compliance testing process that NOVA does for them. It takes time to get through all the census data, to run the various compliance tests, to get the results out. And the audit is a just as involved process. And so getting through that is going to take some time. It can be an efficient process, but it doesn't mean it's going to be fast.
Yes, well, and also because some data is not available until later too. So this is kind of a good broad strokes middle ground. With that being said, we have turned stuff around in a week. It's just, as a plan sponsor and the service providers in particular, it just becomes a less pleasant experience when a plan's engaging us October, 10th or 9th, for example, compared to, early in the year. It's pretty easy onboarding. Yeah, I mean, even through July is fine, but usually the more advanced notice, the more planned things are, the smoother it feels for everybody.
Yeah, and it should be noted that this 6-week turnaround time doesn't mean that this is the only thing that you as a plan sponsor are doing for these 6 weeks, right? Like, now, if you're doing a week turnaround, then yeah, you're probably working 40 hours plus just getting that audit done. But
actually, we do try and limit it to around like an hour or two of plan sponsor time, kind of ideally tops. And it really depends on the complexity of the plan. There's a lot of factors that go into it, but we really do try and work with the provider just from an efficiency and kind of really a client service aspect of it, because they have the data, the background, everything, the vast majority of what we need. There's certain things that need to come on the plan sponsor side, but we really do try and minimize that impact where we can.
Yep, nice.
The data preparation. So this is kind of a nice one to think about in terms of this is actually even before it goes to NOVA, is either if your advisor encouraging your clients to work through this, or a plan sponsor if you're in a different department working together with potentially the accounting department, HR payroll, getting together and kind of taking a look at, hey, this census, does it agree to our annual payroll report? And does that ideally agree to the trust report and the record keeping system? And really NOVA does all this on the back end, and so do we as well too. But it does help avoid any kind of additional back and forth. If you have a little bit of a pulse on, hey, contributions tie out, and potentially between that payroll report and the census, does compensation tie out to the best of our knowledge as well too? That one gets a little bit more complicated sometimes, and there can be timing issues, but usually trying to give that a first pass is kind of a best practice in terms of working through that component of it. And also to being cognizant of this one, it'd be nice if there was just kind of a bright line standard of like, hey, it's 5 business days or 3 or 7 or whatever FSNDOL refers to as timely. A little bit of it is based on your systems and ability to remit from a timing standpoint. So overall, it's good to be consistent at a minimum. Really, that kind of 3 to 5 business day range is sweet spot. And really maintaining consistency is super important on that side too, which can be challenging. Sometimes, there's a lot more automation going on. Sometimes when there's system changes though, and or vacations, HR team member turnover, things along those lines, that's sometimes where we see that bubble up a little bit more. And the other thing to be cognizant of, we're usually relatively flexible and try to help where we can, but making sure that those plan documents are the final version. Because sometimes there can be drafts floating around or things along those lines. So, you don't want to get down the road and it looks like there's a bunch of exceptions and you're like, oh, we actually changed that last minute and it's this. Is kind of ideal to work through on the front end, and kind of having that executed copy is one of the best ways of making sure that is that final version, and final amendments and provisions. And then if there is any kind of compliance testing or correction taken, making sure that you're documenting. And that's another thing that's really nice about Nova. They have really robust compliance team that handles corrections, which is really rare. There are some platforms, even if they made the error, they're like, you got to go sort that elsewhere, go get, an ERISA attorney. They have an ERISA attorney on staff. So there really is just kind of a nice full life cycle, regardless of where you are. Even if you fell off the tracks, it's kind of nice to know that someone's available to put you back on the tracks and get sorted. So that brings us, I think, to the next slide. We have a little bit more deep dive.
Perfect segue, Travis.
Yes, 100%. And these are kind of some of the things that we really see that are pretty common in plan audits. To be honest, it's so much better for us to have a conversation with you about it. And then we've been Nova versus a regulator having correspondence with it. So it is one of those things where nobody's looking to have this happen, but it's much better to discuss it, find it, and correct it in year one versus a regulator come in and be like, oh goodness, this is 10 years back, and be like, oh, we changed payroll providers 5 years back. And then it just becomes a very expensive, long drawn out correction process with attorneys involved versus something that's just put back on the tracks, ready to go. So like we talked about, late contributions are kind of a big one. Definition of compensation can creep up there as well too. The one that is kind of not everyone always talks about, but we do kind of see a lot is loan process and procedures that are kind of outside of that IRC bounds. Just a lot of it is changing, potentially providers or payroll side of things, integrations not getting set up timely in that side of things. So that definitely can be something to keep top of mind of, maintaining loans timely. And once again, too, if you're in an unbundled environment with Nova, a lot of times they're really doing a lot of keeping you on the track, so to speak, versus, kind of a little bit more of a DIY approach, in which case you'd have to be a little bit more involved in both kind of the setup and the maintenance of that. Typically, we do have a link to the IRS voluntary correction program and their top 10, which is pretty similar to what we see as well too. Usually it's not that different of a compliance environment and lens that they look through versus, kind of the Title I and Title II things that fall off the rails, so to speak. But yeah, once again, really, we've had fantastic luck working with Nova's correction side of things too, because we have had, essentially, even when you engage an ERISA attorney, they're really expensive. And a lot of times what ends up happening is they are not getting into that level of detail, like at the individual participant census level. They're just preparing that filing. So to have an option that's less expensive, integrated, has the data available, and is also willing to roll the sleeves up and do the calcs is just not that prevalent in the market. So definitely appreciate that, because usually we're the first lens sometimes that is catching some of that stuff. So it's nice, especially they will take, this is super rare, will take clients that are not currently with them on the administration side, just for the correction side, which is really, really nice and a fantastic outlet for us. Because sometimes as auditors, we can find the issues, but with independence rules, we can only go so far in helping to correct. So it's really been a nice addition for us to get a better understanding of how robust that department is for them and what they're able to tackle, which is great. It's good news.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that we like in working with firms like Metz is, we know the kind of backup that you guys look for as auditors, right? To be able to say, hey, this correction has been completed. And so when Nova prepares that correction work, we're telling our clients, okay, look, it's not a big deal that you correct it. There's no such thing as 401k jail, right? Like everything is fixable. But when you do that fixing, you want to make sure that you're keeping all the notes about it. When did you find out about it? Who did you engage to fix it? How did you communicate the fix? Did you do it on the timelines that you were instructed to? And if you can provide all that to the audit firm, like that makes the process go so much faster and so much more smoothly.
100%. Nice. So these are kind of some of the resources that are available. There's two that kind of get a little bit more granular in terms of what to ask when you're interviewing auditors. Additionally, you kind of co-prepare some aspects, even if it's just a quick primer and you're not actually filling the document, but there's a Nova version of what are those qualitative factors that drive quality audits. To ask, or at a minimum, kind of have top of mind when you're having a little bit less informal RFP process or kind of a review or benchmarking. So all food for thought. And I think those are planned to go out with the slide deck. So you'll have access to those resources as well.
Yep.
These are all really good ones. You can actually look up firms' peer review reports as well too. So those are publicly available. That's kind of new. There's a clearinghouse through AICPA, which is part of that overall audit quality initiative that they are primary on as well too. You can look up if a firm's an AICPA Employee Benefit Plan Audit Quality Center member. We actually happen to serve on the executive committee or the governing body for that entity as well too, which is always nice to get a sneak peek in terms of what's coming down the pipeline. And then looking up, is a firm licensed, period. To be honest, highly unlikely that your CPA is unlicensed. It has happened. I've literally run into it, but really, really rare. Wouldn't anticipate that, but they may not be licensed in your state. So the mobility law has gone a long way, but there are still states like New York or Hawaii where we've had to get hard licensed with. So they are still out there, and I think it's good to be cognizant of, hey, are you licensed here? A little less of an issue than it was 10 years ago. It used to be pretty prevalent. Now, a lot of states have adopted mobility laws where an Arizona CPA is comparable to, say, a Wisconsin CPA. Some states still have filing and practice privilege requirements. So it doesn't hurt to ask. It doesn't hurt to look it up. Short answer. But those are the resources. If you wanted to dig deep, we're always available and have quite a bit of intel, and can tell you off the cuff, if you have any information, or we can provide it to Nova as well too, in terms of number of audits that a firm does is publicly available. So that is relatively easy and kind of one of the main drivers of quality, at least according to FSNDOL, which makes sense.
Yep. Nice. All right, and so that brings us to our Q&A section. I've been monitoring the chat and our Q&A board, and nothing has come across, which means that you and I have done a fantastic job, Travis, of preemptively answering every question that someone could come up with. However, we do, you are able to still submit questions. If you would rather email your Nova account manager directly with any questions that you have, we can definitely get you the right answer there. And then Ava would be mad at me if I didn't direct you to our other additional webinars that Nova offers here on our website. So definitely sign up. We have more coming, and lots of ways to help you make your plan run more smoothly and more effectively. So Travis, I really appreciate you coming out today for this webinar. Thank you for your time. Any last wrap-up words you would like to share?
No, thanks for having us. Definitely always a pleasure working with some of the most streamlined plans for both the compliance and operational aspect as well too. So definitely appreciate the privilege to work with you, and thanks for having me.
And then really quickly, if you did miss this, or if you want to go back and look, we will be posting it on our YouTube. And then on our YouTube, we also have our past recordings as well, which is our YouTube is Nova 401k Associates, and you should be able to find everything. All right. Thank you guys again. Thanks, Travis. Thanks, Jason. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
You too. Cheers. Thanks
Thank
again.
you. Goodbye.
Bye.